let's talk about dinosaurs again. I've always loved dinosaurs. As I mentioned a couple weeks ago, dinosaurs are, like, my first memory ever is of, getting a toy dinosaur when I was 4 years old. It was my birthday, my 4th birthday. It was literally first memory ever. But as a child of the 90s, there was one thing, more than anything else, that really added fuel to what would become an unquenchable fire of imagination when it came to dinosaurs, and that is the Jurassic Park series. Absolutely, the Jurassic Park series. See, some of you guys are a little bit older than me, some of you all are a little bit younger than me, and so you don't understand how amazing Jurassic Park was to a 9-year-old. I mean, that is peak, that is prime Jurassic Park. Because, you see, my entire life, I've been reading about dinosaurs, I've been playing with dinosaur toys. For me, dinosaurs were, this thing in my imagination, and yet with Jurassic Park, they came to life. And it's funny, you watch movies today, and I don't want to sound like an old man, but you watch movies today, and it's very obvious that they're computer generated. But here's what's amazing about Jurassic Park, is they just built giant dinosaur puppets. And it was just, these giant animatronic things, and they looked so real. Like, to a 9-year-old, that may as well have been a documentary, because it just seemed so perfect and so real. And in the case of one dinosaur in particular, so scary. And that dinosaur, of course, is the Velociraptor. The Velociraptor, if you haven't seen the movie, first of all, if you haven't seen the movie, just go watch it this afternoon. I don't care what your plans are. I don't care if you got like a family something. Your family will get over it. Go watch Jurassic Park. But anyway, in Jurassic Park, there are these Velociraptors. And the Velociraptor is this giant, basically this giant human-sized T-Rex kind of thing with a giant tail and like a machete on its foot. And these things were they were smarter than wolves. They were actually smarter than most humans in the movie. And they hunted in packs. And they were just absolutely so awesome and so terrifying. And to a 9-year-old, again, think about 9-year-old Drew watching this for the first time. I'm used to reading about, the type of foliage that Stegosauruses like to eat. And then here's a Velociraptor just ripping people apart with its toes. I mean, this was awesome. So awesome. But there's this thing about the Velociraptor in Jurassic Park that we need to admit, and that is this. It's not based in anything actually true. In real life, Velociraptors were not the size of people. They were the size of small dogs, 20 pounds. In real life, Velociraptors were not all that smart unless you think possums are smart. Paleontologists think that they were about, as intelligent as possums. They were still pretty scary. They'd still eat you, but it would take a lot of them, and you could probably outsmart them because, you're a human, and they're tiny little dinosaur things. The truth is, Velociraptors in Jurassic Park are a lie. But you know what also is true? They're a beautiful lie. I mean, really, it makes the Jurassic Park world so much better to embellish the Velociraptor. I've never heard anybody that watches Jurassic Park and says, well, that was a great movie, except for those Velociraptors. I wish they weren't there. Nobody's ever said that, and no one will ever say that, because that would be lunacy. It's better, and not only is it better in that it's more entertaining, but it actually in no way, shape, or form detracts from the point. I mean, it actually even kind of helps it. Now, the point of Jurassic Park, again, if you haven't seen it, I'm sorry, but the point of Jurassic Park is, one of two things. Either we shouldn't mess with nature, or, as Jeff Goldblum said, life finds a way. Either way, no matter what point you take, the Velociraptor, in all its glory, helps with that. It doesn't matter if it's as realistic as, that redheaded chick running away from the T-Rex in her high heels in the last movie. It doesn't matter if it's just super unrealistic and a lie. The point is made, and it's awesome. The Velociraptor, as it turns out, is a lot like a lot of things in life. It might be a lie, but it's a helpful one. You see, so often in our modern way of thinking, we think that you can only communicate truth if everything you're saying is based in a fact. And that is simply not true. In fact, it seems like, if you read the scriptures, that God believes the best way to communicate truth is by not telling facts, but instead telling stories. I say that because one day God became a human being. That human being one day became a rabbi who taught the truth about God and love and life and people and his kingdom and ethics and right and wrong and all the different things that God wanted us to know. And that guy was obviously Jesus, and when Jesus taught about all of those things, we're told that more than he did anything else, Jesus told stories. Jesus shared with the ancient world the velociraptor. He shared with them things that were not based in fact, but were absolutely rooted in truth. Now, we call these stories parables. That sounds a lot more Jesus-y, a lot more religious, a lot more devout. You know, it sounds like a churchy word. But all a parable is a story that you tell to make some sort of point. Usually, in fact, there are multiple points you can make with the parables. It's not just one point, it's actually multiple. The idea is that you hear a story and then you can think it through and you can come to one conclusion and your neighbor can come to a different conclusion. You guys can talk about it and that's all well and good. That's the way that God, when he became a man, wanted to teach us the truth. He told stories. And he said, I want you to talk about those stories. I want you to think about these stories. And I want you to come to your conclusions. I want to teach you the truth without teaching you facts. I bring all of this up because last week we left things on a bit of a cliffhanger. Last week we kind of just dumped some stuff out, dumped the can of worms out, and asked you guys to sit with it for the last week, and now we've got to clean all this up. You see, for the last couple weeks, we've been talking about the concept of hell in the scriptures. We've been talking about how, for most people, hell is this really scary thing, but that's not a great thing at all, because the Bible teaches us that when we know God, we will be led away from fear towards love. That fear and love are actually opposites, and that the further away from fear we get, the closer to love we get. And the further from love we get, the closer to fear we get. So just because Jesus talked about hell and taught about hell does not mean that it should be frightening to us. And so in this conversation we've had the last couple of weeks, we've come to two conclusions, two different ideas that add up to a big question. 2 weeks ago, we came to the conclusion that the power of hell does not rest with any bad guy. The power of hell does not rest with anyone who might want to hurt us or persecute us or hinder us or do anything to us that's bad at all. But instead, the power of hell resides with God and only with God. So the power of hell, only with God. Last week, we talked about what hell specifically is. And as we talked specifically about what the first century church would have heard when they heard their word for hell, which is Gehenna, we talked about how it's this valley, it's this historical truth, that there's all sorts of things going on, and that the result of knowing that is that we can see that God told them that he didn't want hell. He didn't plan hell. Hell wasn't his idea. It wasn't something he willed for anyone or planned for anyone. God would rather there was no hell than there be hell. And in fact, the predominant picture of hell that we think about, which is, people being burned, God specifically says, that's not something I do. That's not something that was my idea at all. So the two conclusions we've come to add up to a question. God is the one with the power of hell, and God doesn't want hell for anybody. So the question is this: why is there hell? Like, why wouldn't, if God has the power of hell and God doesn't want hell, why would the only teaching about hell not be, oh, hey, it doesn't exist? Like, hell not existing at all would actually get the job done of God, God's will being nobody, in hell, and then also would be right in line with God having control of hell. It makes a lot of sense to our brains that, we would say, well, there's no hell. And yet Jesus teaches about hell over and over and over, and hell has always been part of Christian teaching. So the question we need to answer is very simple. If God has control of hell, he has the power of hell, and if God does not want hell for anyone, then why would hell exist at all? And to answer that, we need to explore one of Jesus' velociraptors, one of his stories, not based in fact, but absolutely rooted in truth. And that story is a story that he told one day of a rich man and Lazarus. Now, one day Jesus was talking to his disciples, and he was telling them about, everybody's favorite subject to talk about in church, and that was money. Jesus was talking to his followers, his disciples, about money and how God views money. And Jesus said a whole lot about it. And in his ministry, Jesus says a whole lot about money. But in this particular day, Jesus comes to a very simple conclusion. He tells his disciples, simply put, he says, you can serve God or you can serve money. You cannot serve both. You get to choose one or the other. The way that Jesus explained it was pretty simple, that money is an idol. It's something that gets in the way of us serving God and serving people and loving people and doing the things we are supposed to do. And we've all seen this in our world. We've all seen this maybe in our own lives. We've seen this in the lives of those around us, that money is something that people will do anything to get and keep. People will trade relationships for money. People will trade their families for money. People will move heaven and earth to get more money. And so Jesus said, everyone who follows me has to make a choice. You can serve God as your God and King and the one that's most important, or you can serve money. Now, Jesus told this to his disciples, but very often as Jesus taught, he taught publicly, and very often some other people that maybe weren't his disciples would be listening in. And in this day, that's exactly what happened. There were some Pharisees who were listening. The Pharisees were the most powerful of Jesus' enemies, the most powerful, the most influential of the religious leaders who didn't like Jesus. And for our purposes, maybe more importantly, they were also the most wealthy of those who disagreed with Jesus and were constantly at odds with him. And so this particular day, we're told that as Jesus told the disciples that you can only serve one out of God or money, that they scoffed and mocked Jesus' teaching. The Pharisees, who loved money and had lots of it, well, it just so happened, coincidentally, that they had made part of their theology a theology of money. They taught that money and wealth and the power that comes with it is always a gift from God. That if you are wealthy, that is evidence that God has blessed you. And if you are not, that's evidence that God has not blessed you. It does make a certain degree of sense. That success, you would ask, okay, well, if I'm successful, where is that success coming from other than from God? And the answer is there's lots of places that can be coming from that don't necessarily have to be with God. But for the Pharisees, they could not get it through their heads. They could not get it through their hearts. They really couldn't get it through their wallets. This idea that God had not blessed them with money, but that in fact, the money they had was an impediment to them coming to the kingdom of God. And so Jesus told them a story to try to disabuse them of that notion. And the story went something like this. One day, Jesus said, there was a man who was very, very wealthy. The richest man anyone had ever seen. He wore the finest clothes. He ate the finest foods. He lived in the finest home in the finest part of town. This man had absolutely everything. And part of what he had was a man who lived at his gate. That man was named Lazarus. And Lazarus was the exact opposite in every way of the rich man. Whereas the rich man wore the finest clothes, Lazarus barely wore clothes at all. While the rich man ate the finest foods, Lazarus was craving, lusting after scraps and leftovers and trash from the man's table so that he wouldn't be hungry. While the man had the finest house in all the land, Lazarus was homeless and had nowhere to go. Lazarus was truly a pitiful, pitiful excuse for a person. He lived all on his own. He was diseased. His only friends were wild dogs, we're told, that licked the sores on his body to comfort him. It's not a good healthcare system. And So it came to pass, Jesus said, that Lazarus died. And it came to pass that the rich man as well died. And Jesus said in the story, as he continued, he said that Lazarus went to the place of the dead, and he went to be with Father Abraham. And there he was comforted. The rich man, however, he was not with Father Abraham. He went to hell, says the King James Bible. And in hell, he was tormented. And then the rich man notices the situation. And at this point, we should probably just go ahead and read this part of the story from Jesus. It is in the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 16. The story continues with this. The rich man shouted, "Father Abraham, have some pity. Send Lazarus over here to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue. I am in anguish in these flames." But Abraham said to him, "Son, remember that during your lifetime you had everything you wanted, and Lazarus had nothing. So now he is here being comforted, and you are in anguish. Besides, there is a great chasm separating us. No one can cross over to you from here, and no one can cross over to us from there." Okay, so a couple of notes before we move on. We have to take a couple of notes here. I've heard this passage of Scripture preached so many times, more times than I can count. Since I was 12 years old and I was aware of what sermons were, I can't tell you how many times I've heard this taught. And it's interesting because one of the things that almost always is taken for granted by preachers is that Jesus is telling the truth about the afterlife. Jesus is giving facts about the afterlife. That there really is this situation where people that are in hell can look up at people who are in heaven, and people who are in heaven can look down at people who are in hell, and there's great chasms separating them, and it can't be crossed, but everybody's watching each other forever. This is sort of what I've been over and over and over. This is taken extremely literally, and it's taken for granted that this is fact. And that's what a theological term I'd like to introduce to you is baloney. That's third-year Bible college stuff. You learn what baloney is. And I say that because this is a parable. Parables are not rooted in fact. It's just not the way it is. This is the velociraptor here. It's embellished. This is a Hollywood embellishment. And anyway, the point of this is not really even to teach about heaven or hell. Remember what the context of this passage is. The context of this passage is teaching the Pharisees why they're wrong about money. And it's very easy to see what Jesus is the point he's trying to make here, okay? You've got a rich man who the Pharisees would have assumed was blessed by God. And this rich man, who, by the way, the Pharisees love the idea of being children of Abraham. They would have seen in the afterlife you would go be with Father Abraham. And yet Jesus tells a story in which a rich man dies and is separated from Abraham and is separated from God's blessing. They also would have assumed that being poor meant God had not blessed you, and yet in this story, Lazarus, the poor man, is with Abraham and is being comforted. This is extremely easy to understand story in which Jesus is reversing the roles of the rich and the poor, is turning on the Pharisees' heads their ideas about wealth and money, and Jesus' whole point is to get them to understand that God is not blessing rich people with money, but in fact, God has nothing to do with money, and how much money you have or don't have has nothing to do with your spiritual state. That's the point of this story. And Jesus uses the afterlife to illustrate that. So that's the point. I will fully admit, the rest of what I'm going to talk about, totally a secondary issue to the story. But it's what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks. It's a little important, so let's talk about that secondary issue. And that's this hell business. Now, we talked about last week how when Jesus talked about hell, that Jesus did not use the term hell, that the word hell doesn't exist in Jesus' language. It doesn't actually exist in any language in the first century. And so when Jesus said the word hell, at least what we read as hell in our Bibles, usually he's using the term Gehenna, which is the Greek word for the Hebrew of Ben Hinnom, which was this valley where children were sacrificed, and the kings of Israel did horrible things, and so God punished them by allowing them to be conquered by the Babylonians, and so hell, or Ben Hinnom, became shorthand for punishment and fire from God. Okay, talked about that last week. I said usually, though, Jesus uses the word Ben Hinnom. Sometimes Jesus uses the word Hades. And wouldn't you know it, this word that our King James Bible translates as hell in this story is the word Hades, which is a Greek term, which is a translation of, or loosely associated with, a Hebrew word called Sheol. So what, you might ask, did Hebrew people think about when they heard the word Sheol, or Hades? And that's a good question. There's really one of two things on the table. You could go with the Bible, or you could go with pop culture. In the Bible, in the first century, or actually going back further than the first century, Sheol in the Bible is a place of the dead. That's probably the best translation of the word Hades anyway. It's not hell, but it's simply the place of the dead, or maybe death itself. You'll see that in a lot of modern translations. But in the Old Testament, whenever they talked about where dead people go, it's not bad. It's not really good either. It's just sort of there. You see, Jewish theology said this about what happens after we die. After we die, Jewish scholars said, you just go to be in Sheol. You go to the grave. You go to the place of the dead. And there you rest, comfortably, I might add. You rest until the judgment. There's going to be a future judgment, and at some future time, God will raise up his righteous people. They will live forever, and that's that. Sheol's not a bad place. Not exactly good, but it's not bad. In fact, there's one story where there's this prophet who gets called back from Sheol by this witch, and the prophet is angry, and he says, "Why have you disturbed my rest?" That's how they understood the place of the dead for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. For centuries, that is what the Bible has taught about what happens to dead people in the Old Testament. So it's absolutely possible that when Jesus talked about Hades or Sheol, that's what popped in people's heads. It's also possible, though, that they thought of something else. You see, our Bibles were written in a specific period of time. But time goes on after our Bibles are written. And so what we find a lot of times when you look at history is that some of the ideas that we see in the scriptures sort of morph and evolve and change. Not within the scriptures, but maybe outside of the scriptures. And one of those ideas comes down to Sheol. You see, when it was just the Hebrews by themselves, they had their very Jewish idea of what Sheol is. But one day, the Greeks come a-conquering, and they do come a-conquering, and suddenly, the Hebrew people intermingle with the Greek people. And the Greeks, they taught something very different about the afterlife. And what we find is that for a while there, that Jewish people started kind of mixing the two ideas of what the Greeks taught and what the Bible has taught. There's this book that's written about 100 years before the birth of Christ. It's called the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch describes what they call Hades. And in Hades, that's a place where everybody goes, and the righteous are rewarded for being righteous, and the wicked are punished for being wicked. And the punishments have various degrees. That some of the people, if they were just a little bit wicked, their punishment maybe lasts for a little bit of time, and then they stop. Or if they're really wicked, then they last for a longer time. And if they're the most wicked, then they last forever. That was the way that sort of people wrote about Hades at that point. Now, it's really important that we understand that the Book of Enoch is not in the Jewish Bible. It's not in any Christian canon either. It's just sort of this work that's out there. So for us, looking at this a couple thousand years after the fact, a question should be asked. What was Jesus assuming when he said Hades? Did he assume a perfectly biblical picture of what it was, and he wasn't thinking about punishment at all when he talked about Sheol? Was Jesus talking about pop culture that has nothing to do with the Bible, but people understood? Is that what Jesus assumed was going on with Hades? Or maybe was Jesus not assuming that either one was right at all, because he's Jesus, he knows what the truth is, he doesn't need to listen to these other people, And that's just the way it is. I'm going to give you an answer to that question right now. Nobody knows. Nobody has any idea. And really, you should probably, like a big red flag is anytime somebody tells you they do know that sort of thing, that's a big red flag that people are just making stuff up and telling you because they want you to believe what they believe. We have no idea what Jesus thought about Hades. No idea. Because Jesus never said, this is what I think about Hades. It never came up. And there were other options on the table. We simply don't know. What we do know, however, is that this topic was anything but clear. If you ask different people in the first century, what do you think about Hades, you may get a variety of answers. And that's okay. That's what we know. And what else we know is that as Jesus shared the velociraptor with his ancient world, that he could tell a story and assume anything he wanted, and it'd be fine. So the point here is not to get a perfect picture of what Hades might be, but instead to learn what it is that Jesus was talking about, which aside from money, there's something incredibly beautiful, I think at least. In this story, we can learn about the afterlife that leads us away from fear and towards love. And that something comes from looking closely at the rich man's attitude towards Lazarus. You see, in the story, no sooner does the rich man realize that Lazarus is with Abraham than he sees Lazarus exactly as he saw Lazarus during his life, which is someone who's beneath him, someone who is less than him, and someone who can serve him. You'll notice what the rich man's idea was. He doesn't speak, by the way, to Lazarus. He tells Abraham to tell Lazarus what to do. He says, hey, Abraham, I'm a little uncomfortable right now. Send Lazarus here to make me feel better. His whole life, he has seen Lazarus as nothing. He's seen Lazarus as a beggar, as a servant, as somebody who is less than him, that his status in life is higher than that of Lazarus's. And amazingly, somehow, it's like death and punishment in Hades hasn't disabused him of that notion. He still believes, apparently, that Lazarus is here to serve him. And so he says, absolutely, hey, send Lazarus. He actually does it a couple times. We didn't read the whole thing, but he says, hey, send Lazarus. Lazarus isn't doing anything else. Lazarus exists for me. Abraham, by the way, corrects him. He's actually a little bit curt with him. He says, hey, by the way, you had everything in life, and now you don't. Lazarus had nothing in life, and so now he's being comforted. And when we think about things from Lazarus' perspective, we think about this story, and we always are talking about the rich man, always. We're always thinking about the rich man. If we think about things from the perspective of Lazarus, there's a reason why Lazarus was being comforted. And a big part of that reason is because the rich man was no longer with him. That sounds a little bit harsh, but think about this for a second. Put yourself in the position of Lazarus in this story. In this story, you lived your entire life as a homeless beggar. Nobody cares about you. Nobody notices you other than wild dogs. You're in physical, emotional, and spiritual agony. And you live in a world in which the rich not only oppress you, but tell you that it is God's will that you are oppressed. If you died and you went to something called heaven, and your roommate was the rich man whose gates you sat at, and every single day he walked by and did not care about you at all, and every single day he was apathetic towards you, and every single day as you begged he gave you nothing, and every single day he assumed that he was inherently superior to you. If you go to some sort of afterlife and that dude is your roommate, well, I gotta be honest, that doesn't sound all that good. That doesn't sound like heaven. What makes Lazarus being comforted actually comforting is the fact that there is this great chasm between him and the person who hurt him his entire life. And if you've been hurt ever by anybody, you can understand. somebody's abused you or hurt you or spent their lives making your life miserable, if you're with them for all eternity, I got to be honest, that doesn't sound like heaven at all. By the way, this is not something we just read in this story. This is something we see over and over and over in Jesus' teaching. Jesus looking at a story and telling a story and essentially concluding that the things in life that go against him, the people in life that make us miserable, they're not in eternity with us. One day Jesus told a story about a king who invited his whole city to a banquet for a wedding feast. And he sent some messengers to some noblemen, and those noblemen killed the messengers. The end of that story is other people were at the festival and the party and the celebration, but those men who killed the messengers, they're not there. The point is, the people who were harmful, they're not there at all. Another time, Jesus told another story, this time about a man who goes away on a trip, and he leaves his money with some servants. Two of the servants were very good, did what they were told. One of the servants doesn't do at all what they're told, and when asked about it, this servant says, well, listen, I was terrified of you. I just assumed that if I made any kind of mistake at all, that I should be afraid of you because you would just punish me. The man was afraid. And fear is the opposite of love, and guess what? The end of that story, the end of that is that in eternity, in the celebration, guess what? The man who was afraid isn't there. Another time, Jesus told another story about another king who looks at all of the nations, and he splits those nations up between the sheep and the goats. The sheep are those people who belong to him, who spend eternity with him, and what he says is the sheep are the people who can look in the eyes of another human being, even and including and especially the people that they don't agree with, that they don't like, that they see as inferior. And when they look that person in the eye, they see the divine image of God, and they treat them with love and grace and mercy anyway. Those are the sheep. The goats are the ones who look at people and see none of that and do not treat anybody accordingly. And guess what? At the end, the goats are not there. Again and again and again and again, Jesus tells stories about afterlife and eternity and forever. And his stories boil down to this: the things that are against God are not there. What makes heaven heavenly, what makes the afterlife beautiful, is the fact that the things that hurt us, the things that stop us from experiencing God's love, things like violence and bloodshed, things like fear and arrogance and pride, things like apathy and not caring about other people, those things aren't part of heaven. And here's what's important here for us to understand. This is not just something we read in Jesus' parables. It's actually something we're told pretty directly, at least as directly as one can read anything from the last book of the Bible. One day, Jesus is sharing his vision of the future with his best friend John. We call that the book of Revelation. And in that, he talks about what heaven looks like. It's the New Jerusalem. Eternity, essentially. And here's what we read in Revelation chapter 21 about what makes that place great. Revelation 21, we read, I heard a loud shout from the throne saying, look, God's home is now among his people. He will live with them, and they will be his people. God himself will be with them, and he will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or sorrow, crying or pain. All these things are gone forever. And then he says the cowards, the unbeliever, and the corrupt, the murderers, the immoral, those who practice witchcraft, idol worship, and all liars. I'm going to pause on that one. 2018. And all liars, their fate is in the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death. You see, it sounds weird, but the beauty of heaven is there because of the reality of hell. You see, heaven's not just amazing because of what's there. It's amazing because of what is not there. Everything that has hurt us, everything that has stopped us from experiencing God's love is not there because God has cast those things and the people who exhibited those things into hell. Now, here's what's cool about this. Here's what's amazing about this idea. We talked a couple weeks ago about how in the early church that they weren't totally sure what hell was. They had different ideas about what hell might be. That some of them believed something called annihilationism, which is that hell is just destroying the wicked. That some of them believed universalism, which is that hell is the place where sins are purged for an amount of time until those sins are gone, and then they can spend eternity with God. Some people believe what has become the traditional viewpoint of infernalism, which is basically just hell is this prison where people are kept forever in torture and anguish and all of that. And then last week, we talked about how that is a perfect reflection of what the Jews believed about hell. That as the Jews talked about Hades and the afterlife, that they too couldn't really agree on whether it was an eternal thing, or whether everybody would be saved in the end, or whether it was temporary and it was destroyed. That people don't always know what hell exactly is. We believe in hell, but we're not sure what hell is. Here's what's cool about this whole idea. No matter what you interpret hell to be, no matter what, this principle of why hell exists is true no matter what. So, let's say you want to be an annihilationist. You want to believe that hell is the destruction of the wicked. Guess what? Since the wicked are destroyed, there is a separation between us and the things that hurt us. Let's say you want to be a universalist. Let's say you want to say, okay, I don't think that's what God would do, so I think that hell is these flames that purge sin, and the sin is gone before they go to heaven. Again, guess what? There's still a separation. Because those sins are purged and done away with, there is still a separation between us and the things that hurt us in heaven. And of course, if you believe in the traditional, what has become the traditional viewpoint of infernalism, well, if people are just in hell locked away forever, guess what? They're separated from us. This great chasm has separated us from the things that hurt us. No matter what you believe about the exact ins and outs of hell, the truth is, they all serve the same purpose. Heaven is beautiful in part, not just because of what God blesses us with, but because of what he shields us from. And in this world we live in, there is so much that hurts us. There is so much suffering. There are so many things that stop you and me and everyone else from fully experiencing the love of God. And because of that, this world is broken. This life is broken. The promise of eternity is that in the next world, in the next life, that which is broken will be put back together. And at the end of the day, all of those things that hurt us and stop us from experiencing God's love are separated from us forever. So we're in our third week of our series called Fear and Brimstone and the Love of God. And as we've talked over the last several weeks about what hell is and why it is not bad news, why it is not something to be afraid of, why it is not something that we should be absolutely terrified of, but instead is something that is good news, we've learned a few lessons. And our third lesson this morning about hell is simply this. Because there is a hell, heaven is a place without anything that stops us from fully experiencing God's love. Because there is a hell, heaven is a place without anything that stops us from fully experiencing God's love. God doesn't want hell for anybody, and God has the power of hell. So why does he keep using it? Because at the end of the day, there is nothing else that can separate us from the things that hurt us than hell. God's got to do something with it. God's got to put things back together by taking things out. And however that works out, no matter what you interpret hell to be, at the end of the day, God has chosen to use hell to shield us from the things that hurt us in this life for eternity. I don't know about you, but that sounds to me like good news. That sounds to me like something that is beautiful. That sounds to me like someone who is loving and gracious and caring, and most of all, trustworthy. This morning, the musicians are coming forward. They're going to sing a song. We offer this invitation each and every week to trust in that God who I think is awfully loving and awfully trustworthy. The Bible teaches that when we believe in who he is, we repent to be baptized. Not to do that because we're afraid of hell, but we understand the beauty of God. We turn to him and say we want things his way in our lives right here and right now. The Bible teaches that a symbolic act of that is baptism. We go down in some water, it's like our old selves being put to death. We go out of the water, it's our new selves being born again, as symbolic of what God has done and is doing in our lives and will always do in our lives. If you've never made that decision, we got a nice warm baptistry. We got all sorts of people who can do it. Let's talk. If you're already an immersed believer in Christ, you're looking for a perfect church home, this place is not it. We do serve a perfect God. We want to connect. We want to call. We want to cultivate. We want to meet new people. We want to share the gospel. We want to grow up while we do it. And most of all, we want to live a life with God without fear, recognizing that even in hell, that God's love is shown. As we stand and as we sing.